Good evening. I'm Penny McPhee, the president of the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, and on behalf of Arthur and the Blank family, I am pleased to welcome you all this evening for what promises to be an exciting and interesting program on the news media and the 2016 election. Tonight's program features a conversation with two of the country's great journalists, Jeff Greenfield and Leonard Pitts.
I'll take it.
And before we turn to our program, you're going to see a short video to introduce the topics of tonight's, the themes of tonight's conversation.
There is a crisis of trust that is pervasive and severe. Trust in Congress is at or near historic lows. Trust in the media is remarkably low, especially among young people.
If people don't feel that their voices are being heard, if they feel inefficacious, if they feel that government officials don't care about what they think, if they feel relatively powerless to the existing system, then they aren't going to ascribe legitimacy to a system.
What we're witnessing with Americans feeling not a part of the democratic experiment is a conflict of ideals and practice, a conflict between a set of values that inform our democracy and hopes and aspirations.
Classical authors like Aristotle defined a ranking, a hierarchy of types of government. Democracy was rather low on the list because it suffered from the tendency to pander to the masses.
We live in a media environment and a popular culture that feeds off of confrontational behavior as a form of entertainment.
Everybody is media now. Everybody is a producer. The political communication field is so sophisticated, so good at bypassing the standing media. They are fundamentally assaulting the legitimacy of the press. In a prior world, I guess it was an easier world. You got to sort of set the game and you had the mass audience. That's no longer the case.
We live in a media environment where people have the ability to filter out information that they don't want to hear and opinions that they don't want to hear.
Fact-checking faces a challenge that is inherent to basic human nature, which is the confirmation bias. As humans, we tend to seek out information that confirms our previously held beliefs and explain away anything that runs counter to it.
We've narrowed the frame about what we think politics should look like so that the frame is around elections as opposed to political participation. We've maintained a fiction that there's an order to be had in our politics. We've believed in this fiction, this mythology, that the elections will render right what is wrong in our lives.
We haven't come up with anything new since Roman days. The elites of Roman times ruled in the name of the people, but of course would tend to advance their own interests. And what was left to the people was the famous Roman saying, panem et circenses, the bread and circuses.
So you've now met 5 experts who helped us put together tonight's conversation, helped us think through the themes that we wanted to talk about with Leonard and with Jeff and with all of you. We recruited Andra Gillespie, Paula Ellis, Alexios Montsarlis, David Kim, and Nikolai Petro to give us their diagnosis of the current state of journalism and our democracy. You heard a little bit from them in this video. You'll see a little bit more from them later. You have their bios, and I hope some of you had a chance to visit with them during the reception. Thank you all for being with us tonight. I also want to recognize our partners in tonight's program, the Poynter Institute, the Atlanta Press Club, Georgia Public Broadcasting, the Morehouse College of Journalism program, and the Vox Teen Journalism program. These are organizations all working to elevate journalism, and we encourage you to get to know them. And thanks to GPB's production team, tonight's program is streaming live. Welcome to all of you who are viewing online. From all the journalists in all the world, we invited Jeff and Leonard for many reasons. Perhaps most of all because they did not arrive tonight to predict the outcome of the election. They are longtime, curious observers of human behavior and witnesses to events who have spent their lives listening to other people and sharing their reactions with readers and viewers. We believe they've earned reputations as trusted voices. They are both truth seekers and truth tellers. For us, they set the bar for what journalism can and should be. One tidbit about each of them that you won't read in their bios. On the CNN desk for election night 2000, Jeff's ad-libbed line, "Oh, waiter, one order of crow," became the symbol of our national uncertainty after TV networks first called Florida for Gore, then said Florida was too close to call, and then, well, you know the rest. Unbeknownst to him until this evening, Leonard is like family to me. I was already living in Miami.
Okay.
I was already living in Miami when he began writing for the Miami Herald in 1991. Those were still the days when you walked down to the end of the driveway to get your morning newspaper and had a cup of coffee with the columnists who enlightened, provoked, and sometimes caused you to change your mind. I agree with the Pulitzer Committee, which said that Leonard has a gift for speaking with passion and compassion to ordinary people on often divisive issues. Thank you both for being with us tonight. Over the past 13 and a half months, since Cleveland hosted that first primary debate on August 6th, 2015, we've all been captivated, would you use that word? By a presidential election that has shone the brightest of lights on journalism and the democratic process. Among the many headlines that grabbed us, as you see from the graphic behind me, is that at least by some measures, democracy itself is in question. We come to our topic tonight with a conviction that there is an essential bond between trustworthy journalism and a flourishing democracy. So tonight we've given an assignment to Jeff and Leonard to share their analysis and ideas on 3 themes that we think are driving a great deal of the current disruption. 1, voter anger is higher than ever and trust has bottomed out. 2, fact-checking is a growth industry. And 3, in many instances this year, journalism has not served us well. Jeff and Leonard, the program is yours.
I'll start with two points. One, where we are now did not spring up 6 months or a year ago. This line about trust in institutions. 1964, 3/4 of Americans believed the government did what was right all or most of the time. 6 years or 10 years later, after Vietnam and Watergate, the number was more like 25 or 30%. It's never come close to a majority. The second point about that is institutions is plural. Faith in virtually every institution is sharply down from what it was a generation or 2 ago. And I'm talking about not just the media, where the latest poll shows that 14% have a fairly high regard of the media, an all-time low. I'm talking about big business, education, the military, the clergy, labor unions, you name it. So that sets the predicate. The second thing I would say is, when I was here 8 years ago, I was reminded by John, it was the day Lehman Brothers went under, which set the beginning of a rather grim period of time. to the point where the average working American still, on a median income level, is making less than he or she did at the start of the millennium. Now you combine, just forget everything else, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. Just put those two things together, massive loss of trust in institutions and a serious, serious body blow to tens of millions of Americans, and you set the stage for an election that is not going to be conducted with great enthusiasm.
I think also one of the panels that we saw on the video mentioned fact-checking being a growth industry. And that really fascinates me. I used to give speeches. I started giving speeches about 10, 15 years ago, and occasionally wrote columns about what I called, and recently called in a column just a few days ago, post-factual America, the fact that we were coming into a country in which people felt free to choose their own facts. And one of my prescriptions in those columns and speeches that I gave 10 or 15 years ago is that we needed more fact-checking. We got to have more fact-checking. It's got to be more vigorous, and this will help to resolve the problem. And I guess I could dine on that dish of crow that was that was mentioned earlier, because we in fact have more fact-checking. I would argue that newspapers could be a little more vigorous, particularly in terms of some of the bigger whoppers that are told. But the fact is, we have more fact-checking, but it doesn't matter, because in post-factual America, you are free to believe whatever it is that suits your particular ideological bias. And until and unless people are, people make a recommitment to the idea that facts matter, that truth matters, we're not going to resolve a whole lot of this. And I frankly don't. I think that there's a role for news media to play, but I think that this, this will be resolved fundamentally at an educational level. This will be resolved in schools with the teaching of critical thinking, and with the hoped for depoliticization of the whole educational structure, so that science teachers can teach science and history teachers can teach science, and somebody, for God's sake, can teach critical thinking. I think that until we do that, we're going to be circling, around a lot of these issues. I'll close with this, which is kind of just funny to me and really illustrates the point. I received an email from a reader on Monday asking me what I was going to do now that Donald Trump is commanding 23% of the African American vote. and I shot back a response, not a very polite response, I have to say. Let me see if I can censor this. I thanked him for the statistic and asked him if it hurt when he pulled it from his backside. But my point in bringing that up is I've been doing this long enough that I knew in sending that out, I did that for my gratification, for my blood pressure, for my health. It's going to have absolutely no impact upon that individual. I've seen this too many times. It's going to have absolutely no impact upon that individual, and that's the frightening part to me. When we have the same body of facts in common, we have the basis to make a good faith discussion or debate or effort to argue and make a change or find a solution. But when your facts are here and my facts are there, we have no basis to even have a discussion. We're like, some people arguing in Spanish and French, about a Korean. It's just we have nothing. We have no basis to have that discussion, and that's America right now.
To take that theme,
yeah,
the connection is to me blindingly clear. If huge majorities of Americans, of all political persuasions, let's say, simply don't trust the media, then fact-checking becomes an exercise in futility.
Yeah.
Very early on, and we're going to have to keep going back to the subject of with no predictions, but because Donald Trump has reshaped everything we thought we knew about politics. So some months ago when he said thousands of Muslims were cheering the fall of the towers from Jersey City, I saw it on television. No, he didn't. Just not like, no, he didn't. He saw people on the West Bank cheering and somehow got it confused. And so when people said to Trump supporters at rallies, well, there's no tape of this, they said, of course not. You guys burned the tapes.
Yeah.
And that's the closed-end system, whether it's the Moonies or Scientology or the Communist Party, no, that didn't happen. The second part about that is, and now I am going to make a political point. The stuff of which fact-checking used to matter matters less, because in this particular campaign, the substance is less important than what it represents. That is, everything, the reason I got Trump wrong early was it turned out that everything I thought was a bug was a feature. So, for instance, the bellicosity, the wild statements that he had to go back on, this wasn't a source of embarrassment to his supporters. This said, you know, all right, he may not mean everything he says, but by God, he's telling it like it is. He's not being polite to all those people that have been screwing me, all those institutions that I have lost trust in. Yeah. And that's why, for instance, the stuff that we remember from old campaigns, where like the Dallas Morning News, for the first time in its history, or 70 years, sorry, has endorsed a Democrat. There was a time when that might have made a difference. Yeah. When Texas Republicans might have said, gee, now it's the media. Doesn't matter if it's a Republican paper or a Democratic paper, it's the media. George H.W. Bush, in fact, has now apparently come out publicly saying, I'm voting for Hillary Clinton. How many Trump supporters is that going to, that's that old rich guy from Kennebunkport, whose son got us into Iraq. And so what you have is that the mechanisms that I'm used to, and I guess that Leonard is used to, where what mattered, has I don't want to overstate this, it matters to some people, that's why his unfavorables are what they are. But there are a lot of people for whom that doesn't matter, because all of you have misled us and betrayed us, and I haven't even got into the more ugly part of this. And so finally we've got a guy rich enough to tell all you people to go to hell. Yeah. He's not going to be bribed because he's got $10 billion, you can't bribe him, and he knows how to beat you guys because he's been part of that game. This is why this campaign, in part, is so astonishingly different, and why these mechanisms in the news media, not counting the fact that they early on turned over endless chunks of time to him at rallies, for which they will have to answer. Even when they got serious, it mattered less.
It's the whole a pox on all their houses thing, and it's again, to get back to what I said a moment ago, it's the fact that, you know, they accuse us, and Trump in barring various news organizations from covering his campaign, accuse them of being factually inaccurate. But somehow there's never a fact that is shown to be in error. So it gets back to this whole thing of what they're calling factual inaccuracy is, you said something I don't want to hear, or you told me something I didn't want to believe. And again, that's a dangerous intellectual spot. We're talking about, you know, you're talking about the media, and it reminds me of a conversation I had with my son years ago. He's 34 now, but this is back, he's like a kid of 7 or 8 or something like that. And one day he comes to me and he's talking to me about how terrible the media is. And the first thing is, okay, kid, those shoes on your feet came from the media, but we'll leave that to the side. The other thing was, what is the media? I asked him, what does that word mean? And he didn't really know. This is something he'd heard people saying, the media is so terrible. And he finally said, the media, well, that's people who they come to your house and they tell you bad things about people. This was his answer, as a 7 or 8 year old. And and I think obviously the people who are supporting Mr. Trump have a slightly more sophisticated understanding of what media are than that. But I think that at the bottom line there's some similarity. Media are those people who say what I don't want to hear, and good media are those people who confirm whatever it is that I want to hear. That's scary. That's frightening.
Just to pick up on this, the instinct. Look, we have seen the media being targets. Just as a matter of history, there was a time back in the 40s when it was the Democrats who railed against the media and the one-party press. Harry Truman, the progressives all said, Henry Luce and Time Magazine and Life and all the big papers, this was a one-party press. 1969, Spiro Agnew began the process by an address that was televised on all 3 networks attacking the press as elitists, all coming from the same narrow spectrum of America, arrogating to themselves the power to say what is and isn't. So now you've got a situation, just yesterday, I guess, Trump said that Lester Holt, well, we know Lester Holt, he's a registered Democrat. He won't be fair to me. Now, Not that it matters. As it turns out, Holt's a registered Republican. Piece of paper's right there. Is that going to matter? Do you think Trump's going to say, gee, I may have made a mistake? Come on. That's not where we are. But the point is, I keep coming back to this point that one of the reasons why I think everybody or most people were surprised by this is that the normal pattern of how the press works in a campaign was described by political scientists Lynn Vavreck and John Sides as rise, scrutiny, decline. Somebody shows up, the press puts the spotlight on, and if they can't, they wilt. It's Herman Cain, it's Michelle Bachmann, it's Ben Carson, it's a lot of people. So with Trump, I spoke to her last week. It was rise, scrutiny, rise. And part of that is, the mechanism is he's standing in for them against all these people who have done them wrong, among which are, thank you for that, the media. Yeah. And I wonder, last week something happened, and I think it's, curious whether it's going to make any difference. And of course, the press being a self-interest group, it took Trump screwing the press to do it. After his birthday announcement, he wouldn't take a pool on a tour, the press pool on a tour, and they promptly went nuts. And the New York Times, page 1, top of the front page, 2-column, quote, news analysis, used the word in the headlines and in the lead paragraphs, lied. Something that, reporters are told, you better be careful. But I don't know how to break this to you folks, but there are 135 million people going to vote in 56 days, and not a whole lot of them read the New York Times.
Yeah. Is it going to make a whole lot of difference? My instinct would be no. Nothing else has made a whole lot of difference. But you kind of touch on something that I've noticed, or my pet theory about media over the last, let's say, 20 years. And I begin this by saying I've got not statistic the first to back this up. This is my pet theory that's been banging around in my...
You could be advising the Trump campaign.
You're right. I don't know what I'm doing. Let's advise your campaign. But it seems to me, my pet theory is this. Back in the 90s, when Mr. Goldberg published his book, Bias, and there was a lot of talk about conservative bias in the media, I think a lot of media folk, took that to heart.
Liberal bias.
Liberal bias, I'm sorry, yeah, liberal bias bias against conservatives in the media. I think a lot of media folk took that to heart and made some efforts to sort of clean up their act and end the sort of de facto bias. I remember one example that was used, which really struck me because it was the kind of thing that being biased had not even occurred to me, and that was the fact that in that era, and maybe still, I don't know, it was routine to refer to conservative, staunchly conservative politicians or public figures as arch-conservative. This sort of modifier that sort of dug a knife into the rim and twisted it just a little. There are no arch-liberals. Okay, that sort of, okay, they've got a point. But I think what happened, and here's my theory, I think what happened is that as news media, we overcorrected. Okay, and what we tried to do was create this model where there is no judgment.
Right. False equivalence.
Yeah, false equivalence. To your point of the New York, it's a big deal. The New York Times says that Trump is lying when Trump has in fact lied pretty much every day as he's drawn breath. It's a big thing that suddenly this is acknowledged. I think the reason for that is that we have tried to create news media without judgment. I remember middle part of the last decade, height of the Iraq War, there's a news story about arms being missing from an Iraqi munitions dump, and this is an embarrassment for the Bush administration. I believe the network was CNN. Rather than report this, there's weapons missing, this is an embarrassment, the White House said so-and-so. They reported it, and then they brought on the talking head from the left wing and the talking head from the right wing to each give their spin. Okay, and this is their way of being fair and balanced. I've checked the right-wing box, I've checked the left-wing box, but the thing is, as a consumer of news, I trust you to have the judgment to tell me what's going on here. And I think there's a certain spinelessness, particularly in terms of broadcast, but probably all over journalism, with regard to our coverage. A few years ago, Anderson Cooper, during the Arab Spring uprising, Anderson Cooper did this report on how the leaders of Egypt were lying on certain facts that they were saying. They were, in fact, lying. Everybody in journalism said they were lying, but everybody jumped on Anderson Cooper for saying that they were lying. There was no controversy about the fact that they were lying, but can we say this? And to me, that's, you know, I understand that you don't want to you don't want to wear your biases on your sleeve. And there's a whole lot of you know, self-induced caution that we undergo as journalists to try to be fair to everybody involved. But I don't think that requires us to be completely without judgment or without guts to say what's what. You know, as specifically as an African American, I wonder what would have happened, you know, to me, or where I would be had media been like that when the civil rights movement was converging on Kelly Ingram Park in Birmingham, or on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you know, in Selma. There was a clear, you know, media were clearly on the side, I think, you know, and had empathy and sympathy for the civil rights marchers. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine them reporting that, you know, those events, the beating on Kelly Ingram Bridge, the dogs and hoses the beating on the Pettus Bridge, the dogs and hoses of the Kelly Ingram Park. I can't imagine them reporting that without judgment.
And in fact, it's one of the reasons why the attacks on the press began down south. There were local stations that blanked out the network news coverage of the civil rights movement, technical difficulties. Which is, you know, so that's what, but let's turn this, before this turns into a rally, I want to offer you a look at the news media and the Clinton-Trump case that from a different perspective. In other words, call me madcap, but I'm detecting a certain tilt in this room toward one of the candidates. So let's look at the other possibilities. I mentioned before that in looking at Donald Trump, it occurred to me that every bug was a feature. And when you look at his opponents, very much including Hillary Clinton, many of the things that you might regard as features are bugs. One of them is experience. There was a time when that was an asset. But, you know, there was an ex-governor of Georgia who made a virtue of his lack of experience in Washington and got to the presidency of the United States. One of Jimmy Carter's lines was, never lived in Washington, I've never served in the Congress. Yeah, well, but the point was, I'm not one of them. And that was a much more benign view. He'd been governor of a state. And then we saw Ross Perot, who in the 1992 debate was asked, you've had no experience. And Perot said, you got a point. I've had no experience in running up a $5 trillion debt. I've had no experience with gridlock in government. And it's judo, what I call political judo. The weakness becomes a strength. So in Hillary Clinton's case, that resume, for many people, is an indictment. You were there when things got bad. And look, you know, is Hillary Clinton next Monday night going to brag about her foreign policy experience? Maybe. But it's not going to take Donald Trump, assuming that he's, you know, on his meds, it's not going to, it doesn't take a genius to say, oh, let's talk about that experience, Madam Secretary. When you were in the Senate, you voted to authorize the use of force in Iraq, the biggest foreign policy disaster possibly in American history. Not only that, you claimed falsely that Saddam Hussein was allied with Al-Qaeda. Then you got to be Secretary of State, and what did we have? Well, we had Libya, we had Syria, we had a complete mess with our relationship with Russia, which, much as you might dislike Putin, might not be a bad idea to have a decent civil relationship with another superpower. In other words, the experience becomes a negative if you are discontent enough with what has happened. And that doesn't even begin to get into the more dicey issues about coming to Washington with her husband to do good and staying to do very well indeed. You know, the net worth is $150 million now. You know, it wasn't Boss Tweed, they didn't steal it, but they certainly cashed in. And so when the nominee of the Democratic Party, you know, says she's going to make life better for the average American, even though in the past people certainly bought that with Franklin Roosevelt, with John Kennedy, with Bobby Kennedy, there's something about that that may ring a little false. And lastly, I just want to say that the press has been, by Clinton supporters, has been severely criticized for creating what they call a false equivalence between the behavior of the Clinton Foundation and her emails and Donald Trump's
Trumpishness.
Yes, Trump. That's a very good word.
You're welcome.
But you know, it is part of the problem is that the press is, I think at this point, has been, you know, focusing very hard on both candidates. And for reasons that are I've tried to explain or tease out, it's having a bigger impact on her than it is on him, because his supporters discount all of it. One last point. No, I'm going to stop filibustering. 2 days after he announced, Mark Cuban, he of Dallas Mavericks and Broadcast.com and Shark Tank and all, said to the press, you guys, you don't understand Donald Trump at all. It doesn't matter what he says. It doesn't matter how many times he contradicts himself. His people are seeing in him their guy.
Yeah. Just to piggyback on what you said about lack of experience as a virtue, I haven't written this column yet, but I've been thinking about it for a while. I don't know if anybody saw the movie Dave. Kevin Kline. Yeah, I love that movie too. Kevin Kline plays a guy who's a look-alike for the president, and he comes in and he sort of fixes everything that the actual president has screwed up. There's a great scene where I'm blanking on the actor's name, but plays his accountant.
Charlie Grodin.
Charles Grodin, yeah, I love Charles Grodin. Playing his accountant, Murray the accountant, is looking at the federal budget because Kevin Kline wants to carve out a little bit of money for a worthwhile project. And he's looking at it saying, my goodness, if I ran look at these books, if I ran my business this way, man, I'd be bankrupt. And he's looking at, you know, the federal budget. All that to say that I think that there is a cherished belief/myth in this country that an amateur can do it better. And I think it's fairly harmless as a myth and fairly harmless as a movie. But when you've got people running, you know, to be commander-in-chief, you know, who you know, to speak of what's Gary, was Johnson, who doesn't know where Aleppo is, what Aleppo is.
Yeah,
and
Gary Johnson.
and you've got, you know, Mr. Trump, who doesn't know, you know, that Russia actually annexed the Ukraine. You know, well, when I guarantee you they're not going to get in there while I'm, you know, they're already there. When you know, when you've got Herman Cain asking, how do you say that in Cuban? You know. And on and on and on. I mean, you know, it's funny as a movie, but the idea that one of these folks, you know, because we're so enamored of the idea that the amateur can do this, the outsider can do this, the idea that one of those folks could end up in charge of the world's largest economy and the world's mightiest military, the giant of the planet, that ought to keep you up at night.
But see, but there's where the response comes in. So I'll hear that argument, and I'll say, okay,
look how they've screwed us up.
But yeah. I mean, you know, Alan Greenspan, you know, the godhead of the Federal Reserve Board, the man who this genius, after everything fell to smithereens, said, and he's still getting paid $100,000 for a speech, by the way. He said, I found a flaw in my thinking. Oh, thank you. Hey, that makes me feel so much better. Your arrogant insistence that you know there was no bubble, everything was fine, exuberance, yay. And so in $5 trillion surplus turned into a $5 trillion deficit. I don't know how many millions of Americans either lost their homes or found their jobs underwater, you know, or homes underwater, went through a terrible economic period. And so my point is, I think it is not irrational up to a point to say, if that's what oh, by the way, what did David Halberstam call his book about the people who got us into Vietnam? The best and the brightest, right? All these really smart people. And then a generation later, I can remember people saying after 9/11, well, thank God George Bush has those experienced, calm hands. You know, Dick Cheney, they know what's going on. So how, and I grant you that Trump is at this end of the, you know, I'm not an expert. And I'm not suggesting that that's a comforting thought. But I think it is not an irrational argument to say, so the people who were supposed to be the smartest in the world about the economy, about foreign policy, brought us the worst economic crisis since the Depression, Iraq and its allied disasters. And as somebody said, if that's what the experts done, bring on the amateurs. I'll quote you a line from Hamilton. I think you can get tickets now. One of the lines that Aaron Burr keeps singing to Alexander Hamilton is, Why do you assume that you're the smartest in the room? Why do you assume that you're the smartest in the room? An attitude like that is going to lead to your doom. Now, it happened to him, but there's another point about that, you know, if you assume that, you know, we know what we're doing, we've been there, and the track record says you really screwed it up, and by the way, you guys don't suffer from that. Nobody who got us into Iraq, you know, wound up being wounded or killed in Iraq, or wound up with traumatic brain injury, or wound up bearing the cost of that war. And nobody who screwed up, the people at the very top who screwed up that economy, they're doing fine. Which is why it's not just Donald Trump who has been the recipient of the help by this anger, it was Bernie Sanders.
Right.
You know, how a 70, I shouldn't, he's a year older than I am, it sounds ancient, but a curmudgeonly 74-year-old Vermont senator who talks like, you know, a Brooklyn cab driver, who was ridden off by the entire establishment wing of the Democratic Party, came pretty damn close to getting that. Now, where did that come from? Well, it came from that same feeling, you know, aimed at Hillary and the Democratic Party. You were there. You know all these people. You've got this foundation. You hang out at Davos all the time. You know every important person in the world. You have policy books, you know. What did Romney have? Binders full of women? She has binders full of policy proposals. And what did it get us? And I don't think you can understand what's happening with Trump simply by asserting, you know, the often malicious and malevolent feeling of his followers. We haven't talked about this, but white nationalism, which is a polite word for racism, is driving a lot of that. All of that's true. But there's another element to this, which in my view is why he is as close as he is. I just saw a number. She has outspent him on television so far 7-1. Then from now to Election Day, her ad buy in Florida is, I think it's $36 million. His is less than $1 million. And he's still competitive.
Wow. I would just say, I'd say this in terms of expert. I mean, you're right. But here's the thing, and I think, and perhaps maybe this is too much to ask people to concede, but expert is not a synonym for perfect or for always going to get it right. You know, the experts obviously screwed us into the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. The experts also gave us a pretty booming economy back in the 90s. You know, the experts, you know, got us into the Iraq debacle. The experts also somehow found Osama bin Laden and sent him to sleep with the fishes. So, you know, I think that there's an ebb and flow. There's a good and bad there. I think that, you know, and I realize you're arguing from the point of view of the Trump followers, but I think that this whole idea that somebody who knows nothing can do the job better than some imperfect individual who knows a lot and screws up occasionally, I think is just a dangerous thing. In terms of fear, yeah, I think that's something that hasn't really been discussed. We talk a lot about how people are sort of taking it in the neck now, and that's the source of all of this anger. But I really am, I'm kind of dubious with that explanation, because I wonder if they're really taking it in the neck to any greater degree than they were 10 years ago or than they were, you know, 30 years ago. You know, there's always been hard times, and but we have not responded in the way, you know, in the ways that we're responding now. I think that it's a mistake to underplay the fact that a lot of this comes up almost simultaneous with the election of the first African American president. I don't think that you can underplay that or overplay that. I think it's race, but I think it's also sexual orientation. I think it's Muslims. I think it's Mexicans. I think it's uppity women. You know, I think it's this whole melange of things that people. That was ironic, ladies. I mean, I'm just sarcastic. Forgive me. You know.
That's right, Leonard.
Hope you all got where I was coming from. But what I'm saying is, I think that's what people. I think that a certain stratum of the electorate perceives that. You know, that their place is under siege and their place is under threat, and that you know Mr. Trump represents, as you said, the guy who's, you know, going to stand up and not going to take it. It doesn't matter if he's unfactual. It doesn't matter if he's inconsistent. Doesn't matter if he's not smooth. Doesn't matter if he's not even always truthful. he's the guy who's going to stand up and poke him in the eye for me.
Okay, I will say, I think there's a lot of merit there. I did a piece for Politico about Pat Buchanan, who in 1992 ran a tough race in New Hampshire, embarrassed President Bush, and in looking at his announcement statement, the echoes, or I guess it's not an echo, it's the presaging of Trump's themes about trade, about internationalism versus nationalism, about immigration, about the screwing of the white working class. It's all there. I also think it's true when you look at some of the reporting that's being done out of the rural Rust Belt towns, things have gotten worse. And they've gotten worse not just because of the loss of manufacturing jobs, but the mediating institutions are collapsing. There was a book years ago called Bowling Alone about the loss of communal activity. Well, now, according to I think this piece was in the Wall Street Journal, it was, from a town in rural Pennsylvania, I'm almost sure. The volunteer fire department doesn't have any people left to put out fires. The Rotary Club, all of the charitable civic enterprises are crumbling because the economy of these towns is crumbling. And you can say, well, it's another transition from one kind of economy to another. But but 20 years ago, one of Clinton's economic advisors who was marginalized, a guy named Joseph Stiglitz, wrote a book called, I think, Globalization and Its Discontent, saying, look, trade is great macro, but there are losers. And the losers tend to be the people who don't have the education to adapt. People who's for generations, I want to work hard, and those jobs are in fact not around. And the notion that, and here's the other thing about the Democratic Party. 25 years ago, Bill Clinton was being very honest with these workers and saying these jobs aren't coming back, but there'll be new jobs because we'll retrain you. No, it didn't happen. And it didn't happen for all kinds of complicated reasons. One of which is if you're a 55-year-old steel worker laid off and somebody says, I got a great job for you as a home health care worker for 1/3 of what you're making, taking care of an 80-year-old incontinent woman, you can call it cultural bias. That's not an attractive second career. And I'm getting into a lot of complicated things, and I don't want to go on, but it is absolutely true that there's always been discontented, disgruntled people, even in the middle of our economic boom, who out of racial animus or cultural animus were angry. But I think the reason it's gotten propelled more is that there's more fuel now. That's all I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think the discontent that you're talking about is part of the overall melange. I guess my thing is that I don't like to. I'm always careful not to want to underplay all of the other cultural aspects of it. But I definitely don't think it's an either-or situation. I think it's a both. I think it's a both-and situation. There are a lot of people out there who are not living the lives that they think they ought to be living.
And were living. And I think that there's a sense that they see fairly or unfairly other people doing well, and it's not necessarily at their expense in the sense that if these people weren't there, then the first people would be doing better. But it's perceived as at their expense. How's this person doing so well? And I'm struggling. I'm doing so poorly. Peggy Noonan, who's a conservative columnist for the Wall Street Journal, has a very apt description. She says the division is between the protected and the unprotected. And by that she means people, it's not rich, but it's people who are relatively comfortable in the new world, who can surf this new world. Maybe you're in a gig economy. Maybe you're doing 5 different jobs, but you're comfortable with it. You're okay with it. And then people, for whom all of these cultural changes and economic changes have felt more like battering rams. Yeah. One of the, Charles Murray did this book about, who would come under a lot of fire a generation ago for writing what seemed to be racially inflammatory stuff about IQ. The more recent book he did was about the white working class. And how the social mechanisms, the divorce, spousal abuse, drug addiction, alcoholism was spreading like wildfire. And we now learned about a month ago that the death rate among middle-aged white men in particular, unlike every other group, has been rising significantly due to drug abuse and alcoholism and its allied ills. And that tells you something about that discontent. I mean, I think the fact, that in general, younger African Americans are more optimistic than middle-aged whites is probably something that I don't know that that's ever happened before. And I'm not sure I think what that's more about is the negative side that these folks are feeling. I asked Austin Goolsbee, who was one of Obama's first-term economic advisors, I said, I'm giving you a magic wand. What are you going to do for the 50-year-old displaced blue-collar worker? And that's what he said. Nothing. I can't do anything for him. I can help younger people. We can do apprenticeship programs and link that with community colleges, and there'll be a manufacturing. But if you're 50-something and you've been laid off job, the rest of your life is not going to be nearly as good as it was. Now, we want politicians who tell the truth, right? You go try telling the truth that way.
Yeah, I'll tell you something else about those folks. To bring this back to the media aspect of it, they are terribly underreported and essentially ignored by us, which perhaps is part of the problem and feeds into the anger. A couple years ago, I finally got my paper to send me to do a story that I'd wanted to do for years. I asked them to send me, let's find the poorest and whitest place in the country, and I'll just go there and start asking questions and talking to people. Yeah. And I ended up spending a week in Owsley County and neighboring counties in Kentucky, and was really fascinated by how much of the markers of white poverty that I saw there were also the same markers that we tend to associate with African American, with race, with African American life, down to and including the fact that the people that I met were incredibly nervous about how I was going to portray them when the story ran. This is something as you know, as African Americans you get used to. Oh Lord, how's this story going to look? You know, and these people had the exact same fear, to the point that I walked into a medical conference and a lady announced in a loud voice for everybody at the next 8 tables that a reporter was here. So watch what you're saying. And I got that pretty much everywhere that I went. I went there, frankly, expecting to have some tension as an African-American man. The tension that I felt far more tension as a reporter going into those places, because these are people who feel they've been shafted when not being ignored by media. And I think that's a story that's been right under our noses, but that we've missed. Mm-hmm. Poverty in this country, first of all, we don't cover poverty much, if at all. The people who are socially, or economically displaced. And then when we cover it, we tend always to cover it as an urban problem among, people of color. And as I tell people, and sometimes maybe it shocks them, among African Americans, the poverty rate is proportionally higher. But there are more poor white people in this country than there are poor everybody else combined. You add everybody else up combined, and you're still going to be a few million less than there are poor white people, and nobody talks about it.
Which is a whole other topic, but that we can't cover in the 15 seconds we have. So we're going to turn to your part of the program.
Thank you, Jeff and Leonard. We're going to take a moment before we open it up to Q&A to hear once again from our 5 experts about some of these issues that Leonard and Jeff have been exploring with us. And then we're going to turn to your questions. And we have a healthy amount of time to do that, but we do have a couple of house rules. 2, but we're firm about them. The first one is, give your name, not your autobiography, when you stand up to ask a question. And 2, and I can't emphasize this enough, you have to have a question. And that doesn't mean a long speech followed by, so what do you think? And I will entertain the host's prerogative, and I'm going to offer the first question to one of our Morehouse journalism students when we come back.
Hopefully, this election will be over at a certain point, and when it is, as a community, academia, media, elected officials can have a serious discussion of how we can turn this pervasive distrust into its healthier cousin, skepticism.
I don't believe you can fight fire with fire. I don't think you can fight anger and hatred and fear with comparable forces. It's a crisis, but it's also an opportunity to respond to the anger, hatred, and fear with love, compassion, generosity.
Where the media bears responsibility is when they choose guests who will take that posture and it elicits great ratings and it, becomes clickbait on the internet, but they say absolutely nothing of substance. And so it would be nice to sometimes switch out some people who say the exact same thing over and over again and have nothing substantive to say with people who might actually have something interesting and informative to say.
Journalism needs to evolve a new role. The mission would still be holding government accountable, so investigative reporting continues on, but you would be thinking about multiple publics.
The future of fact-checking undoubtedly involves automation. Automating parts of the fact-checking process will get fact-checks published faster and closer to where the readers actually want them. Necessarily, the future of fact-checking will also involve a greater role for social networks and Google.
You can't turn a blind eye to the problems that are going on and just dismiss people as being rabble-rousers without actually seeking to talk to people and understand what their grievances and concerns are and actually seek to address those issues. It's important to broaden the table and make sure that people really feel like they have access to the table. It's also important to make sure that you have ideological diversity. We should expect that greater diversity is going to initially lead to greater conflict, but that conflict should then push us to figure out how to work together.
If you feel that the existing political structure can be salvaged, you try to reform the political structures and the political system, not the candidates, but the system itself, so that it produces better candidates, the kind that you could vote for.
I'm very optimistic about the future. I think we're at a moment, it's probably going to be longer than a moment, of a serious set of transformations relating to our governance structure and certainly to the field of journalism.
So I want to thank Ron Thomas from Morehouse for bringing his journalism students this evening. And which one is going to start our questions?
Can you get to the mic?
I'm Diablo Deloach, and I know you were talking about the truth and like how in some of the parts like how there's like this brutal truth. If just telling the truth isn't enough to build trust, what are between the media and the government? How can we build trust between each other?
Go ahead.
Oh, gee, thanks. Well, as I said, the issue is not factuality, and if factuality built trust, I think there'd be some. I don't make any argument for media being perfect. Lord knows I'm not, and nobody that I know who works in media is. But by and large, we not one are factual, and two care with a great passion about getting it right, about being fair. So if those things were indeed the building blocks of trust, we wouldn't be here having this discussion. I think, to go back to what I said earlier, that this problem is resolved not in newsrooms but in classrooms. I think that there is entirely, I think that we have evolved a generation of poorly educated Americans, poorly educated about civic life, poorly educated about their history, and not incidentally poorly educated about science, and poorly educated about critical thinking. I tell students all the time, I don't care what you think, I care that you think. And that's what we seem to have given ourselves permission to go away from. Again, to go back to the example I gave a moment ago, when a guy just feels free to pull, out of his southern regions, 23% of African Americans support Donald Trump. Just send it out, just for the heck of it. That is really, to me, a sign of what time it is in this country. I'll give you another example, not from a nameless guy. John Kyle, a junior senator from Arizona, said a few years ago in complaining about Planned Parenthood that 90% of what they do is abortions. And it's pointed out to him that 3% of what they do is abortions. And his office issues a statement, quote, "That was not intended to be a factual statement." This is a written statement, meaning they had time to think about what they were going to say. Okay? When you see that kind of stuff happening over and over and over and over again, it tells you that, you know, something different has gone on here in terms of how people are educated and in terms of how people relate to this whole idea of having any kind of responsibility to tell the truth. We, within the framework of human frailties in media, particularly, you know, in newspapers, you know, tell the truth, you know, as best we are able. But people have got to want the truth and be able to recognize the truth when they see it, and that's, you know, that's something else.
There's two quick points to that. There was this piece that popped up a couple of days ago, said that among large segments of Trump supporters, you know, Trump said climate change is a hoax. Okay. So the question is, okay, but 2015 was the hottest year on record. Now that's not an opinion. We don't know. You know, maybe it had nothing to do with human climate, but a huge chunk of his voters didn't believe that, which is in effect like saying 2 + 2 is 4. I don't believe that.
Yeah.
That's the first problem. Now, in terms of what Mr. Pitts talked about educated, if you really want to be depressed, if this hasn't happened enough already, there's a Facebook thing that I saw that some reporter went out at I don't know what college and interviewed any number of college students. You know what Jay Leonard used to do, jaywalking, where there was this hilarious fact that all these people knew nothing?
When was the War of 1812? Yeah.
Wait, you think, okay.
Yeah.
So the first question that these students were asked was, who won the Civil War? Civil War? Shh. Person after person after person. You know, and then they kind of be proud of that. Gee, I don't know. Second question, who's the sitting vice president of the United States? Shh. So part of our dilemma is, even if we tell as close as we can come to telling the truth or being factually accurate, what shall it profit us if A, people don't even accept that, or B, are so disconnected from everything but their smartphones and, you know, the hunt for Pokemon Go, that they don't know what's, you know, I'm reasonably sure my 7-year-old grandson could answer those questions.
There are 2 mics, one on either side of the room. Please use them.
Thank you. I just happened to sit here, so
That was
figured
convenient.
somebody needed to be quick. Michael Robertson, and I guess I've got a lot of questions, but if you look at what you're talking about, that there's a lot of discontent and problems, we blame the President of the United States for all of our problems. Does he really have anything to do with it? But the media, every time something bad happens, they trot up the President of the United States to make a statement. When do we talk about the good things?
It's a very good question. I would call it a meme, but I don't know what that is. So there's a kind of thing that's going on. Maybe I'll call it a thing. That's on Twitter now, where somebody will say, flight delayed 4 hours, and the inevitable answer is, I blame Obama.
Yeah. Thanks, Obama.
Which is, yeah, thanks, Obama, which is, you know. And you're quite right. I mean, part of what has happened, it's long time coming. It goes back actually probably to the first PR president, who was Teddy Roosevelt, not Franklin. But the notion that the president is the administrative head of the executive branch of the federal government. And we have, you know, people talk about, you know, Barack Obama created 18 million jobs. No, that's not what happened. At best, what you would say is he helped set the economic conditions under which those jobs were created. And that's part of the drive, the magnetism of covering the Oval Office, you know, this all-powerful guy. And it's a very valuable point. And the idea, but here again, if a candidate campaigned for the presidency and said, I'm going to treat you people like grown-ups, all right? During one of the town meeting debates, somebody said to Clinton and Bush and Perot, you know, we are your children. We are your children. And none of them had the brains to say, what are you, crazy? Grow up. You're 40 years old. You're not my children. And that's, you know, I don't count that as like up here as the most serious issue, but it is a definite problem in how we cover politics.
I'm good.
You take the next one.
Maria, and then Emery.
He was up first.
No, go, you go.
Okay. Maria Saporta, journalist. How are you? Not to try and change the doom and gloom feeling that y'all are trying to set forward, but how do you explain Obama's favorability ratings of being at 58% in the light of everything that's been going on? And also the column by David Brooks saying that he will actually miss President Obama and the civility that he brought to the office. Are we in a period where the pendulum has swung and possibly could swing back? Or how do you explain that response given the campaign climate?
I think there's two things. I think one, he looks awfully good by comparison with you know what's vying to replace him, and two, I think that toward the end of any such relationship, toward the end of any presidency, I think that there is a tendency to sort of be nostalgic for or to to start seeing the good side of the the individual that's leaving office. Obama's not the only guy whose favorability ratings have risen. George W. Bush, who left office as one of the least popular presidents in modern American history, his favorability ratings have also taken a bounce. Why? He's not president anymore. He's not making any decisions anymore. So I think there is also some of that going on.
Anything to add?
Looks for me.
Emery.
Emery Morseberger, early Jeb Bush supporter. How did the media allow itself to be hijacked by Donald Trump? We went
good
to
one.
all Trump all the time from the beginning of the primary until now.
There are going to be about 500 books and panels and conferences. It's already started. And I can only give you the head notes, okay? Part of it was, bear with me, you're not going to like that. Part of it was legitimate in this sense. Trump announces for president, almost immediately moves to the top of the polls. And one thing you have to remember that I didn't, and my wife reminded me, she said, I just binge watched The Apprentice for 3 or 4 hours. You know what, on that show, he's a commanding executive leader, right? So for how long has that show been on? 10 years? Millions of Americans saw Donald Trump that way before he ever announced, and probably were more familiar with him than any of the candidates, not to mention the fact that he was this meteorically fascinating guy. Second, when that happened, the press saw, the old cartoons where a cartoon character sees like a diamond and the dollar signs? Well, that's what happened. When Trump, in that first debate, 24 million people watched the first debate, unheard of in a primary. 22 million of them did it for him. And what did the network say? I'm quoting you now, Les Moonves, who runs CBS. He said, Donald Trump may not be good for America, but he sure is good for CBS.
Yeah.
Bring it on, Donald. Yeah.
And CNN, for the second debate, raised their ad rates by a factor of 10. Third thing was because he drew eyeballs. I mean, it was terribly unfair in a civic sense to clear an hour of TV time for a Trump rally, even before it began. There's Wolf Blitzer. The plane is on the terminal. Any minute now will be coming to the podium. And it's odd, when Scott Walker would hold a rally, or your guy, who was, by the way, great on the Emmys the other night as the limo driver, didn't happen. And what also didn't happen was the critical faculty didn't start kicking in until relatively late in the game. It did kick in, but there was no question that he got an enormous boost, both because he was a legitimate newsworthy figure, and because the cable network saw a chance for dough.
Yeah. People talk about the bias of media, of liberal versus conservative, and I've always thought the actual bias in media, we're biased toward a show. We're biased towards some sense of drama. We're like, I don't know if anybody saw the movie Up with the dog, the dog is squirrel, That particularly broadcast, that's us, that's broadcast media. And Donald Trump was the biggest, most fascinating squirrel, you ever saw, and we just went chasing the squirrel. There's this sense of drama. There's this sense of entertainment. I think the other thing, and the thing that sort of allowed us to do this, was that I don't think anybody took him seriously. So it's early in the campaign. Let's have a show. And we've seen this repeatedly over over the last few campaigns, maybe even longer than the last few. We've had these sort of entertainment value candidates. We've had Herman Cain. We've had Freudian slip. We had Herman Cain. We had people, candidates that nobody really took seriously, but who were sort of entertaining. And I think people thought Trump was going to be that guy. And the fact of the matter is, by the time they realized what Trump was, the coverage has become a lot harder now for whatever value that's going to be. But at the time when he was first rising, he was just this outrageous guy who can entertain us and who can bring viewers to the television.
Your guy's super PAC had $110 million, right? How many delegates? 4? Yes. I'd have done it for much less.
Yes, we're going to go to one of our experts.
Well, thank you. So to put this in a bit of a broader context, I think you have excellent critiques of what's wrong with the candidates. But alongside that, we have enduring loss of faith in institutions. And part of that comes from the lack of the system of institutions that we have. They're not changing. They're not responding to the lack of trust. There can only be one outcome. The dam has to break at some point. Or what has to happen, or what else has to happen in our political system for the institutions to begin to respond to public anger.
There's a very smart political analyst, former operative named Matthew Dowd, is on ABC. And he says the only way this is going to stop is when the system is blown up by the voters, not physically. He's talking about an alternative to the two parties. That's I know now, but this is kind of like the big bands are coming back, and jet travel is a fad. I've been hearing about this pretty much all my life, and I do think that the mechanisms are in place, particularly the ability of candidates to raise money in small increments through social media, and the demassification of the media, that potentially something like this could happen. But without giving you a monograph, the barriers to an effective alternative to the two-party system are enormous, often put in place by the two parties. Mm-hmm. And one way to think about this is, let's say Michael Bloomberg had run for president. Clearly he had the resources. Let's say somehow he could have won. Then what? Who carries his legislative program in the Congress? Or is he basically like Jesse Ventura in Minnesota as governor, neutered for 4 years? So, when you start thinking about how you actually dismantle this system, it's way more complicated even than figuring out how you elect an independent president. But that's one part.
Let's go over.
Dr. Joyce Morley. I am a relationship expert, and I'm a member of the DeKalb County School Board. The irony is that you all were talking about truth, and one of the things when we were passing the resolution yesterday on the Opportunity School District, and I talked about the fact that most people don't want to hear the truth. And we all know that Hillary has not been given many times by the media an equal opportunity to be showcased. And we talk about the fact that you all mentioned that Donald Trump has spent basically nothing, almost nothing, Hillary $36 million. But when does the truth come out? And we talk about the drugs in the white community in the suburbs, but we've known that drugs have always been in the African-American community. When does the media get the guts and the galls to push through and be able to push the truth and say, this is what we've noticed? Hillary is not there because she has not been given an equal opportunity. African Americans with the drugs that were there, they weren't given equal opportunity. When does the media actually challenge people to give the truth, stand on the truth, and begin to present the truth, and see what people will do with it?
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
You are entirely too generous. I don't know where to begin. I'll just have to fall back on this. I think that the question is not giving the truth. Granted, there are things that media, should have covered. Like I said a moment ago, white poverty is an issue that hasn't been covered. Drugs in the African American community is an issue that has never really been covered properly. The fact of the matter is that, there are more, by a huge factor, there's more drugs and drug dealing in white America than there is in African American. About 85% of drug sales, I believe it is non-African American. That's something that we haven't covered as well. But in terms of wanting the truth, there are two components to that. One is editors and producers have to have the guts to want to dig out and ferret out and tell this truth, and people have to have the open-mindedness enough to want this truth. There's two components here. There are two components, and without either one of those, what you have left is the sound of a single hand clapping.
My name is Philippa Meester. I'm a journalist, and I find it. I'd like to ask you whether you feel that you've been too generous to the media. I feel as though it's been absolutely disgraceful throughout, in particular the television media. And I would like your opinion also on the fact that we have CNN, which was at one stage, before it became an entertainment show, a good thing. But then you have Fox, which you haven't mentioned, which is run by one man who has the Republican Party in his pocket. And we have not discussed the fact that millions, you can hardly go into a public building in Atlanta and you're not watching Fox Media. And this is what
Fox?
Fox.
So what is the question?
Fox in
The
Atlanta.
question is, do you not feel that the media in itself has a lot of responsibility? I feel that you gave them far too much credit for trying to present the fact.
Well, I think the thing that, if you'll notice, what I have said repeatedly is, and I've made it a point to sort of carve out newspapers, that act of putting news on dead trees, from the rest of media. Because I do feel, I don't watch a whole lot of cable news, and it's for essentially those reasons. Cable news is an entertainment show. I watch cable news if there's a breaking situation of a shooting or a gas leak or something where I need a helicopter shot of something, something that's breaking right now. School's under siege, then I'll turn to CNN as the best of a pretty bad lot. I hope there's no CNN reporters in this room. I'll turn to CNN as the best of a pretty bad lot, but. Other than that, I really, cable news feels more like an entertainment show, and so it's not something that I watch a lot. But there are other forms of news. There's PBS, there's NPR, and there's the New York Times, and there's the Washington Post, and there's the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. There's all these other folks who are within the bounds of increasingly. Okay. There's all these other folks who are within the bounds of...
No, I'm sorry. You know what you didn't mention?
Who?
You didn't mention Snapchat. You didn't mention Facebook. You didn't mention Google. You didn't mention Instagram. You didn't mention Pinterest.
Yeah.
And you and I both are on that side of the generational fall.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying.
There was a reason. This was not unintentional. I see those as disseminators, and they often point me to stuff online usually from a newspaper's website or something like that I will trust, but they aggregate, they don't dig out, they don't ferret out and tell their own.
It's changing. BuzzFeed is changing.
BuzzFeed, yes.
Vice is a new half-hour show. I think there are new, forms being born that may actually speak to folks, under a certain age, and maybe those college kids will someday learn who won the Civil War. I just want to make one point.
Who did win that war, by the way?
Oh, stop. You elitist. I want to respond to the Jeremiah or the Jacques about the news. And it's just one basic, I think, fact. Because people, everywhere I go here, well, there's Fox, audience like this is probably the target. And there's MSNBC, and then there's CNN, which is in the middle, but has 15 analysts on in 3 seconds each. On an average night, roughly 5 million households are tuned to one of the 3 cable news networks. This is a country where in November, conservatively, 135 million people are going to vote, which means that the overwhelming majority of Americans are not getting their news from Fox, and even fewer from MSNBC or CNN. That does not mean there isn't polarization going on, and it doesn't mean there isn't this retreat to the corners. We haven't even talked about that, and so I'll give you one factoid to show you how polarized this country has become. Two factoids. One is, it used to be that you could expect about 30% of Democrats and 30% of Republicans, more or less, I'm talking about a generation ago, to vote for the other party for president. Now it's more like 5%. The most accurate way to figure out how somebody's going to vote is just ask him or her, what party are you in? Which tends to produce polarization. That's the Democrat, I'm for her. I'm this Republican, I'm for him. Second, years ago, some polling agency asked a whimsical question. How would you feel if your child married somebody from the other political party?
I saw that.
And somewhere, this was the 70s, right? Maybe not 5% said it would bug me, and 5% said. The most recent numbers, about 35% of Democrats and 50% of Republicans said they'd really be bothered. You know, so the old line, how would you like your daughter to marry a?
Yeah.
Now it's a Republican or a Democrat.
True.
That's part of what's going on here. And that's also why the resistance to what you've called the truth is as heavy as it is. If I tell you a truth that bothers you or upsets you politically, you are not going to accept that with good grace. You're not going to. We all think, by the way, we want the truth. I want a candidate who's going to tell me the truth. No, you don't. You want a candidate who will tell you a truth that makes you feel comfortable.
What did Jack Nicholson say?
Again.
You can't handle the truth.
Let's go over here.
Craig Larson, and I have a nonpartisan question. Let's rate the media. Let's rate the press. The way I see it is that you got three different worlds here. You have a world that is strictly facts. You have a world that's biased and trying to convince you to go the way they're thinking. And then you have, I would like to see more of, people that present issues in such a way that it evokes the audience to come to their own conclusions. So if you had to rate that in categories, I mean, we're talking about truth and trust in the media. How much would you put in those categories?
Well, it depends on which aspect of the media that you're talking about. The thing that I always remind people is that media is a plural term. So when you talk about media, you're talking about Snapchat and Google, you're talking about the New York Times, you're talking about Fox News and MSNBC, you're talking about the CBS Evening News. So, you know, it's by definition a pretty broad question. I would say that there has been a tendency in media, particularly among cable news folk, to go more toward opinion as entertainment, which I think has diminished the entire product, than there has been on focusing on actual ferreting out of news and things that are of importance to people. I think that's been a, and I say this as an opinion writer, okay, but I think that the over-reliance on opinion in the news industry has been a net negative for the news industry.
I'll just add a 30-second history note. The press in the United States in the earliest days of the Republic was nothing but biased.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, the newspapers were paid arms of the two political factions. Very first election of 1800, you know, Jefferson had his newspapers, Adams had his newspapers. The Jefferson papers called John Adams a hermaphroditic toady for the British crown, and the Adams papers called Jefferson an atheistic whoremonger who wished to make our wives and daughters the victims of legalized forced prostitution. Pretty high level, huh?
Hi, I'm Melody Daring, and I'm a journalist. I've spent most of my career in small town newspapers and a few in the larger media outlets. Do you think, and I'm trying to phrase this to be short, in small town papers, the local community love us, the reporters, the government officials hate us, okay? Because we're always asking them questions on behalf of the community and fighting for those in the community. They come in, I have this problem, we try to ask questions. But yet you ask those same community people about how they feel about national media. They hate the national media, and they feel the government loves the national media. So do you think, and spending a little time in Washington, D.C., I have some insight into that too, but do you feel that the disconnect between those who work in the national, I call it the national media, the big organizations, in mainstream America is because of a lack of real tough investigative journalism for the 24/7 news cycle? Or do you feel it's because those in national media, the demographic does not fit mainstream America in the sense that national media is mostly upper income, liberal, highly educated, live in a city, and most America, small town, basically, for the most part, middle line conservative, middle income. Do you feel like it's either that it's more lack of investigative stuff to help mainstream America on the government, or do you feel like it's just a demographic problem that you guys can't understand small community?
Really good question, but in the interest of bringing fact, most Americans don't live in small towns. Most Americans live in metropolitan areas or the suburbs. I mean, that's just a fact. And that's one of the problems that we've had, is that small town America, which is rural and older, is getting left behind because they're getting less populous, they have less political power. Now, to your point, Theodore H. White wrote The Making of the President's books. 50 years ago was making the point that journalism was radically changing. It used to be essentially a blue-collar, not profession, craft. And some of the great reporters of earlier times never went to college. Some of them never finished high school. And over time, journalists have become more like me, in the sense of, I have a law degree, which blessedly I never had to use, as did Tim Russert, I think as did George Stephanopoulos. There's a whole bunch of the general way of national reporters now is highly educated, affluent, at least at the top, cosmopolitan, and that means cosmopolitan in their values, secular. Not all. Russert, Chris Matthews, others, they're regular mass attenders, but they're a minority. And I do think that that gap is part of what has happened, that the comfort level of anybody like me is high. Even, it just is. And compared to the people who are at the very top, it's ludicrous. So the idea that, doesn't mean that a reporter can't go out and learn. That's what a reporter does. When Pitts went down to Kentucky,
County, Kentucky.
I don't know, he was educated, cosmopolitan guy. If you're a good reporter, you find out what's going on. And I do think that there's been a lack of that, definitely.
I'll just add this. I'll co-sign most of what you said, but I'm always amused when I hear the term media elite, because the first time a reader called me that, I was driving a 12-year-old minivan with like 150,000 miles on it. And I'm saying to myself, I am many things, but elite is not one of them. That said, you're right. We've reached an era where, most of us who work in this field, there's higher education, higher incomes perhaps than you see, among the nation at large. And I think we saw that really play out when Hurricane Katrina swamped New Orleans. I still remember, and am frankly a little, disgusted by all the reporters who were so shocked that there were people who were too poor in this country to get out of the way of a major storm.
To jump into their cars.
Yeah. Why don't they just get in their cars and get out of the way? Well, there are no cars, and not everybody has a credit card to be able to afford, 5 days or whatever it is at a freeway, at an off-ramp hotel or motel. And these are things that for most reporters are just like, not part of their world. So I think that's part of the danger that you get in having, all of us being from, or so many of us, I should say, being from, certain strata of society.
So we have time for 2 more questions. We're going to take one from this young man, and we're going to take one from a family member.
Okay, my turn. All right, so my name is Khalil Shipman. I'm a journalist working with Vox Teen Communications, a newspaper based here in downtown Atlanta. And you guys spoke earlier on on how basically right now is raised a generation of uneducated young people. So what I wanted to ask is, what is the role of the youth in educating themselves and disseminating that information to educate their peers?
I think that's an excellent question. I think that the school, and when we talk about the undereducation of our young people, let me make one thing really clear: it's not their fault. I think our kids have been undereducated because we allowed school boards to be turned into political footballs, and because we spent so much time, too much time, particularly in the 90s, concerned about their self-esteem, guarding their self-esteem as opposed to trying to teach them. I think those two things have been disastrous. So yeah, I think you're very smart to want to take ownership of your education. Turn off the internet. They have these places called libraries. Do they still have those here? Okay. And seriously, whatever the subject is, get yourself a book and start reading. I use myself as an example. I thought I got a pretty decent education. I came out of school and realized, I knew absolutely nothing about history. Okay. I'm a big history buff now, but I'm a big history buff not because of what I learned in school, but because of what I taught myself after school. Years after I left University of Southern California, I found myself in the library reading old newspapers of essential historic events. I read the LA Times coverage of the Watts riots. I read the Washington Post coverage of the vote after Pearl Harbor to authorize the First World War. And I was amazed, because in history that I'd been taught in school, it's kind of boring. It's like, who did what on what date, what general said what on what date, and the doggone Smoot-Hawley tariff, had to remember that, okay? But then you start reading this stuff, and it's fascinating. It's people dying and buildings burning and people in fear, and you're not taught this. So if you're not given this stuff, and that goes for history, literature, science, whatever, then go get it. You have an absolute, not just a need, but a right to this information. And if your schools or whomever is not giving it to you, demand it from them. And if they're not doing it, then go to one of those places I told you called libraries and get it for yourself.
Or, if I may, go on the internet and use Google, because it's much easier. I had exactly the same experience as Leonard. I would go into the University of Wisconsin stacks, get black lung disease from the crumbly newspapers, because I really wanted to learn what had happened in the 20 and 30 years before I was born.
Yeah.
Now, Google, God, will give you all those newspapers when you want them. And so if you don't do it, it's your fault, it's your kids, it's your crazy music, and get off my lawn.
Yeah, I'm being a little facetious, and he's right, I'm being a little facetious in dismissing the internet. My concern about the internet, there's a ton of great stuff on there, but you need to be able to discern the stuff that's authoritative from the stuff that's 23% of African Americans are now supporting Donald Trump. That's my concern about the internet. You need to be able to bring some discernment to it.
You look at newspapers on the internet.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I look at newspapers. I look at books. I do a lot of research on the internet. But okay, real quick story. I'm stretching time here, but there was a teacher told me once about a young lady who was assigned in high school level, was assigned to write a paper on Martin Luther King. And she went to martinlutherking.org and essentially copied what she wrote, what she saw there. martinlutherking.org, I hear the awes there, is a white supremacist website, okay? And this young lady, a black girl, just copied it all down, like, oh, sexual pervert and degenerate, okay. And she turns in that report. So use the internet with caution is all I'm saying, okay?
Fair point.
Emily Blank, close us out with the last question, please.
Hi, I'm Emily, and my question is, if you were Lester Holt, what would be your strategy to conduct the debate on Monday?
What a great question.
That is a great question.
That is a great question. Thank you. Good night. Okay, I can start by telling you what he shouldn't do, because Jim Lehrer did it, and while I admire Jim Lehrer, this is the wrong question is, why are you more qualified to be president than your opponent? Because it's too broad, right? So they've broken this debate down into 15-minute segments to vote, and I'm not sure what the first issue is. If it's national security, I think you want to get fairly specific, and you want to confront the candidates with a specific proposal of one of them. This is, Mr. Trump, you have said that if NATO nations are attacked, you might not come to their assistance if they have not paid their bills. If they, why is that not a policy that is virtually surrender, whatever, however you phrase the question. And then, and I think this is really important distinction, you do not fact check as a moderator. You fact check as an interviewer, which is why Matt Lauer did such a dreadful job. But as Lear himself, as a moderator, you don't fact check. What you do is you turn to the opponent and say, Secretary Clinton, what's your reaction to his response? You try to get them off the, what my former political operative boss called the agaboo, broad 30,000 feet answers, and start them out with specifics. That's the first, that's, I think, the most important thing. And then I do think, there's nothing wrong in each case with raising, a critical point about each of them. That, with Secretary Clinton, you said experience is a valuable asset, but it's the kind of, but you voted to authorize the Iraq War. You've pursued an adventurous policy in Libya that seems to be a disaster, and Syria is a mess, and you're reset with Russia. What good is that experience? And then Trump, Mr. Trump, you, on the other hand, don't know what a nuclear triad is. You thought Crimea hadn't been invaded when it in fact had. Aren't you taking this inexperienced thing, or she might, I keep coming back to the point of being kind of not so broad. And that's where I think he's under, I have a strong amount of empathy for him, because no matter what he does, people are going to hear bias, But that's.
I ditto. I would co-sign that. I think that one of the things that for me has been missing in this campaign, mostly from Mr. Trump, but really from both candidates, is any level of specificity in terms of this is what I would do if you gave me the presidency. So I would like to hear that from them on foreign affairs. I'd like to hear from them on domestic matters. I'd like, there's a whole raft of, of things that have gone, if not undiscussed, under-discussed. And I would really push them for some specificity. I think the key not that I've done debate moderation or anything like that, but for me the key would be, can I get them off their talking points? Can I push them off their talking points and get them into, I'd like to see how they think on their feet, and I would craft questions designed to push them to that.
I'll just tell you, the reason I'm so glad you asked the question is, you know how they say that I'm glad you asked that question, and they're not.
They're really not. Yeah.
Yeah, I am. Because I've literally watched every presidential debate. I've covered them since 1980. I've written books. I used to be in my evil life as a political operative, a debate prepper. We'd sit with the candidates, and if you asked me to game out Secretary Clinton's strategy here, I don't know what I would say, because I have no idea what to expect. I don't know who's going to show up. I do think, to be candid, that if Trump had any discipline, he could walk away from this debate the winner. Not just because he's Trump, because of the various ways that there are to play what I call political judo and turn her strength into weakness. But given everything we've seen about Donald Trump, I'm equally prepared to believe, that he will do something we've never seen before in a debate.
Please join me in thanking Leonard and Jeff.
Well done, sir.
Likewise. And I really want to thank Alexios, Paula, David, Andra, and Nikolai for being part of our program tonight, for helping us think about these issues as we prepared for this evening. We will post the video from tonight's program on our website, so be on the lookout for our newsletter and stay in touch with us via Twitter and Facebook. And for all of you who are interested in elevating the role of journalism in the democratic process here in our own community, we have a takeaway for you with details on upcoming events and programming from the Atlanta Press Club and GPB. So you can make a difference by engaging with these organizations. Thank you for joining us.